Leviticus 23:16 states that Shavuot is going to be 50 days after the Sabbath. Now, within the Second Temple Judaism, there was actually two ways of interpreting this command. One was to consider Passover itself the high Sabbath of the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and start counting 50 days from that. No matter what day of the week that was, start counting, and then 50 days later, that is going to be Shavuot. The second interpretation is that the Sabbath mentioned in Leviticus is actually the weekly Sabbath, and that would be a fixed day of the week, and you would have to then start counting 50 days after that, which would always fall on a Sunday. So the Shavuot is always on a Sunday. And this is the interpretation that the Christians will use, being the interpretation where Shavuot or Pentecost is always on a Sunday. There are sects of Karaite Jews. That was an 8th century later division that started with trying to go back to a more literal interpretation of the Bible. And there are several tens of thousands of Karaite Jews around the world that are celebrating according to the same counting and interpretation of the scriptures as the Christians. Now, within Rabbinic Judaism, of course, they do not follow this interpretation. They follow the alternative interpretation, saying that Shavuot is never going to be always on a Sunday. It's going to always be 50 days from the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and that is going to vary from year to year. This year it did happen to start on a Sunday, but every other year it's going to be different. And the reason why, again, that the rabbinic tradition is different has to do back in time to when Christianity and Judaism differed, when they separated, that they were one religion, Second Temple Judaism, that had several different rival groups. The Pharisees had rival groups within themselves. The followers of the school of Hillel and the followers of the school of Shammai, for instance, the Pharisees were segregated and divided, and then both sects of the Pharisees were divided against the Sadducees that were more or less like Karaites today, and they were divided against the Herodians and the Essenes and the Zealots and so on and so forth. And then when the Christians came onto the scene, they were another sect within Second Temple Judaism. Now, why that's so important to note is because within Second Temple Judaism, there were people celebrating the Feast of Shavuot differently. Okay? Some of those in the 1st century AD were celebrating the Feast of Shavuot according to the one calculation and interpretation of the scripture. Others did it a different way. And so during the time of Christ and his apostles, there were two ways to keep the Feast of Shavuot. Now, because of the significance within Christianity that Shavuot plays, that this is now Pentecost, this is when the speaking in tongues happened, this is a very important festival. This is 10 days after Christ ascended into heaven. The Orthodox prayer cycles are very much based on, we start praying, O Vasilev Irani and Paraclet Diplomatis Letheus. We start praying a certain prayer today, and then all the way until Easter next year, we do the exact same prayer, and then we commemorate the 50 days of Shavuot, according to Orthodox Christian tradition. Now, why this is so important to note that there's a difference is because the rabbis, specifically after the destruction of the Second Temple, they wanted to make sure that their form of Judaism was not Christian. And because their form of Judaism was not Christian, what ended up happening is when there were two different ways that the Jews used to celebrate Shavuot, and they would do it differently because they both understood this differently. Now, because one of them is taken as a Christian tradition, the other alternative is going to be the Jewish tradition. And this is how it ends up happening, that the Jews are actually all in sync, keeping Shavuot a week ago, with only a few offsets of the Karaites being we're going to do it the old way, we're going to do it the original way, with the Christians. Why this is so important to note is to understand that within the 1st century, there were two ways to understand Leviticus 23:16, and this is not something that the Christians changed later at the Council of Nicaea or anything crazy like that. It's not something that the Jews changed later. It's something that was already a division in the 1st century AD, and that because the Christians ended up taking the one interpretation, the Jews that were anti-Jesus Christ ended up with only one alternative for the most part, that is. And yet, where there's two Jews, there's always three opinions, and so there's going to be an offshoot like the Karaites that are going to do their own thing anyways, and not be with the Jews and not be with the Christians and be off on their own. And that is Judaism in a nutshell. Thank you very much, and happy Shavuot.